Welcome back to the Sea of Startups, where Southeast Asia's startup game gets real. No hype, no fluff, just bold takes and honest conversations with the people building and backing what's next. Because behind every glossy founding headline lies a more complicated and more interesting behind the scenes story. And that's exactly where we want to be. I'm Kimberly, the producer and co host of this relaunch, and alongside Kevin Brooklyn of Indelible Ventures, we are here to pull back the curtain on what it really takes to build and win in the region's fastest growing markets. If episode 1 was our reset, this one's the road less founded. About we will be talking about seed strapping, that gritty middle between bootstrapping yourself into burnout and raising so much you lose control of your cap table or your vision. It's capital with constraint, strategy with soul. And today, Kevin's in a hot seat. So, Kev, for everyone tuning in, the burning question here is what is seed strapping and why should founders care when the default advice has always been go big or go home?
Yeah, seed strapping is just another option that kind of sits in between. You still need some level of funding, but it's basically raising lean, the minimum that you need so that you can get real traction. It basically helps preserve your optionality instead of round after round of dilution and being pushed into going all out on growth at all costs. It's more about you got to be capital efficient. You got to leverage the tools to get more out of what you have, but you don't necessarily have to kind of starve your vision of being able to get to that finish line.
It's a bit of finding that balance in terms of either capital and then also not trying to sell your soul. But who chooses this route? Is it a deliberate decision? Or is this a Southeast Asian thing? Or do you think it's applicable everywhere?
So to be honest with you, I think it's a little bit of all of it actually. So seed strapping is really evolving from the aspect of we have a lot more tooling that is enabling us to get much more efficient. So the reason why it's starting to become a topic of conversation these days is because almost every single startup out there is squeezing as much juice out of the AI tools that they can, and they're finding that they don't need as much headcount to get as much done. And what's your biggest cost center in building a startup? It's the headcount and it's the sales and marketing. What are the two biggest costs that you're having to constantly raise money for? It's those two buckets. If I don't need as much, maybe I can just raise and be more capital efficient. I think this is a little bit more relevant in Southeast Asia that don't have as much liquidity in the capital stock, so there's not as abundant of sources of funding as you would see in other markets. I think it's a combination. Is it everywhere? I would say yes, but it's probably more relevant in places that where the capital provider ecosystem is still more nascent.
Right. So, in a way, the founder's version of soft launch and manifest, not the spray and play with the market. Investors are more risk adverse now. Do you think that's trend going to be the future? AI being this disruptive. Everyone's using ChatGPT at this point.
A series of other tools that are out there. But it is true. We're in a scenario where we just don't have to follow that same path. So I think the aspect of launch and manifest is very true. For a long time, people have generally said your best source of financing is revenue. And if you can be more efficient from the profit from that revenue, then you can build as such. But oftentimes when you're in that launch phase, you need a little bit extra because not everyone is coming from wealthy backgrounds or exiting out of big corporate careers where they've got a bank account that can sustain them for a year or two while they're getting underway. And there is an aspect of the early stage capital that launch and manifest with a little bit of firepower of capital could end up being sufficient for a number of types of businesses.
In some ways, it's a new way of funding now. Okay, hold up. Before we get too deep in that mindset, let's rewind. Weren't always the VC in black tees or opinionated LinkedIn post. Who was the pre-indelible Kevin?
Yeah, so most part, I've been on the finance side. I thought I was going to go into your typical Wall Street career. I was a quant, I was expecting to go into structured products, but I came out in 2008 when all of that was toxic. Got a job that was on Wall Street when my job offer was rescinded. Got into with a boutique brokerage firm where my window literally looked at the New York Stock Exchange. But that was terrible. I couldn't stand that, so I transitioned to distressed assets with Tiger Capital. Was fantastic there. Transitioned again to a global PE firm that was more operationally heavy. That was global. Got me across the world and to countries and places most people can't point out on maps. And then transitioned again and just kept on going earlier and earlier stage, and finally found my calling with Indelible Ventures, which I launched back at the very end of 2021. A big part of that journey is like founders can come from anywhere. I grew up in kind of a middle of nowhere place in the US, and I'm old enough from an age where we didn't have the internet at the earliest days of my life. It came around later, but I still know the noise of having to use dial-up, which probably is like completely unfamiliar to 90% of the people that are listening to this. But there was a time where we had wires on our phones and all kinds of other things that are probably going to end up in an antique museum. But ultimately, it just kind of evolved my perspective on capital markets, the inefficiencies that happen in nascent markets, the gaps that can appear when people just aren't looking hard enough and appreciating the nuances of one place to another. That ultimately led me to launch Indelible. At its beginning, very Malaysia centric, but it was always with regional ambition.
I can totally resonate. We still had that too.
Yeah, yeah.
So in 2008, you kind of escaped the whole Lehman Brothers scandal by the skin of your teeth, and you ended distress. It's quite ironic, but kudos to you
Yeah.
to escape, man.
A little bit of a twist in my path, but I think a lot of times, a person's journey is not a straight line.
No, it's not. The growth isn't always linear, like we all know about that. But hard to
Exactly.
accept sometimes, though, I gotta say, when it comes to really putting in the work. Now, next question. Why, of all places in Southeast Asia, out of curiosity, why was the calling in Malaysia? Was it because of the food, maybe? Or of all ecosystems, or what made you bet on this one?
So the origin there is that it started with me relocating into the region for a regional role where I was covering emerging Asia. And Malaysia was pure pragmatism. It was the location where it had the connectivity of the airport, it had the good infrastructure, low cost of living, prevalence of English, all of the things that make it an easy place to use as home base and to bring my wife. Fast forward, and I started noticing that there was a big opportunity that people were just not paying enough attention to. When I arrived, Malaysia was a super happening ecosystem. It was probably number two in the region. But then a few years later, it was no longer. Its relative market position from my observation had fallen. And I think that the enabling characteristics were all still positive. So there was a disconnect. And part of it was the inefficiency of the allocation of capital because it chased the wrong market, the wrong thesis, the wrong strategy in my mind. And that was one of the reasons why to say, hey, I'm gonna prove my thesis, and Malaysia is gonna be my starting point.
Cool. And was that aha moment, or was more like, hey, I'm just gonna do this, just gonna prove it on and, keep going from there. And I'm doing this for myself.
I wouldn't necessarily say I'm doing it for myself. I'm doing it for where I believe that there's an opportunity because I'd like to think that there's positive impact that comes from me focusing my attention on markets where not enough people are. It's not just about me, but like anybody that starts something, it generally has a competitive nature to them. I certainly do. There is like a self motivated interest that I want to prove it for my own sort of sanity and self affirmation. But I think there's a broader impact that could happen if and when my thesis is proved out.
In a sense, a bit of allergy to red tape. Started your own version of fun of be funded.
Yeah, yeah. To be honest with you, like, I'm good at my job, but I'm not a good employee. I realized the aspect of red tape. It was quite hard the higher I got of having to deal with the decision making of more rigid
Mhm.
investment firms. And also there's essentially kind of glass ceiling that I hit where that next step I needed to take up was going to wait for somebody to retire or die. Uh, at the place that I was at. And unfortunately, he was like 10 years my senior, so that the likelihood of either of those outcomes happening was pretty low. But then it came to refunded. Like I gotta make the leap and start pushing on my own. And it's a little bit interesting because when you're starting your own fund, it's entrepreneurial, but you're also the funder, so you're the two sides of the spectrum at the same time.
And I can't stress much as well, like the name of your fund, it's pretty apt, making an indelible mark to it as well.
Funny enough, the name oftentimes gets mispronounced the first time.
Right.
When people read it, the mind plays tricks on you. So when you know a word and it's misspelled, sometimes you'll still read it.
Yeah.
The mind trick that it happens to people is they'll read it as inedible.
Oh, okay.
But when I correct them, then it
Right.
truly sticks in their head forever because of that correction. And it earns the
Right.
indelible thereafter.
There you go.
I'd anecdote on that one.
It's worth putting out there, and it's about time to make your mark. Yeah, in our second episode, it's good to get a foundation right. Not every founder needs a Series A to survive, right? Let's unpack that. Seed strap. It's not just about money, is it?
No, no. I mean, you're really talking about maintaining your vision, control, and maybe not necessarily autonomy because it's a group of co-founders or what, but it's not chasing the hype, the growth at all costs, and some of the pressure that can come along with it necessarily. You can still accomplish that same by fundraising from the right people, but there's a bit of a different mix. There's a common saying of a lot of startups don't die from starvation, they die from indigestion. And it's a joke because like some companies, if they raise too much, now they're being pressured to spend it as fast as possible. So now you bit off more than you can chew when you're dying from indigestion because like you're getting pulled in too many different ways. If you're trying to do everything well, you're doing nothing well. You know what I mean? But there's a further aspect of when you complement that characteristic of sometimes it doesn't make the most amount of sense to go big in regards to your fundraise. The flip side of it is sometimes it's just not available. You should be default alive when you're building a startup. You should not have to raise to survive. You should raise to grow if that's necessary. And these days, you're becoming more and more able to raise from revenue. The non dilutive, the best form of funding is revenue. You can simply be better and more efficient at increasing your revenue. And that's your accelerant.
Wow, that's cool. So you're reinvesting your revenues again and again, and to grow, not to survive.
Yeah, exactly. And Berkeley, the B2B space has been very subscription oriented. And oftentimes you're
Uh,
paying an annual
okay.
subscription in advance. If you can stack up prepayments, a lot of service businesses and physical goods companies, you're getting paid after you've delivered the service. The beauty on B2B software historically has been sure there's a lot of front-loaded cost to R&D, product development, etc. But once you start securing customers, you're getting prepaid in advance on 12-month contracts. And so there's a beauty to being able to leverage and push to accelerate your scale, assuming you have capital efficient operations.
Right. Have you backed founders like this? What the common thread you have noticed early on?
Yeah, we don't have any one man unicorns, kind of like the hot topic that people like to throw around these days. But because it's part of the way we're selecting people, our founders are by nature capital efficient operators. Inevitably, there's an initial burn rate because that's the point of getting off the launch. But there's always the pathway back to profitability and cash flow positive, which is essentially default alive. You have to have enough runway to get back to being cash flow positive to survive. And oftentimes, there's the cliche saying, you just need to survive long enough to get lucky. There is an inherent challenge because you have to be good at capital allocation. When you don't have massive money resources, you have to pick and choose what you can spend your time on. And so while that sounds like a bug, it's actually a feature because you shouldn't be trying to do everything at the same time.
That applies to all of us, right? It gets overwhelming and then we don't get anything done. Same thing, same as
Yeah, in life and work and in entrepreneurship.
And when do you think this mindset backfires? Or
I mean,
does it ever?
you can certainly be over conservative, too slow of a pathway of capturing market and building moats. Historically, this has been one of the aspects of using capital as a weapon. Uh, I think that is deteriorating, and it applies more to certain industries than others. But in regards to like software that is infrastructure for an enterprise, it's very challenging to rip and replace. So you want to be early in being able to get to market so that you can get ingrained. And so there's an advantage to trying to move fast because then if you're trying to replacement cycles start adding an additional complication and to your go to market. If you're creating new categories, for example, the way that ride hailing did, they had to basically throw tons of money at it to conquer the market because there was a first mover advantage and it created moats around it. Most businesses do not have those network effects and don't operate that way. So throwing crazy amounts of cash at capturing market does not necessarily work the same for every business. It's a small subset where there's really strong network effects. In general, I think everything is a balance between kind of the positive and negative of any sort of pathway. Is you still need to be aggressive.
So seed strapping is like building a house with just foundation money.
Let's call it you bought the cement and now you're chopping down the trees.
And maybe hoping duct tape counts as insulation.
So, something along those lines. So now everyone's equipped with AI tooling. Like everyone has their John Deere or Caterpillar equipment on premise, so we don't have to worry about those like heavy liftings.
But I think that also needs some, not recommended using duct tape though, but sometimes something's to stick. Anyway, so say I'm a founder. I just closed a modest seed round and looking at seed strapping, what should the next 12 months look like?
A small team. Don't go crazy on hiring. And you need to accelerate those feedback loops. The time it takes you to get sufficient amount of information so you can iterate and adjust. Because like building a startup boils down to three things in a cycle. Assemble a great team, build a great product that customers want, then delight those customers. Come back, improve your team, improve your product, delight more customers. Like it's a cycle repeat. But in the early days, like you're staying lean with your team. You want to make sure you're filling the appropriate gaps. And again, it comes to like capital allocation and shortening those feedback loops so that when you're building product and when you put it out in the market, you're getting fast feedback. So you're responding and iterating because otherwise you could waste marketing dollars, product development dollars. When you factor that in, tools that make us more efficient, like the superpowers from these AI code writers. I won't start naming names. Everybody's probably using their own versions and things are crashing from the walls and who knows what. But like there's the saying, your 2x developer is now a 10x developer. Your 10x developer, 100x. So like in the reality is spending $10,000 the equivalent of like spending $100,000 yesterday. So like we can be more cash efficient and you can get better delivery out of your team. So That puts you onto the path for runaway for revenue. If you're getting your revenue, you're getting more runway. That basically puts you on to the proper pathway. Clean ops is better than kind of like this whole growth theater spectacle.
You were saying about gaps just now. What do founders, how do they fall into this gap? Can this work outside B2B software as a service? And when's the right time to raise more?
To be honest with you, anything that's
Yeah.
not capex
Yeah.
intensive, this can work for. I'm not saying Series A and beyond is completely unnecessary because there is perfectly fine justification to raise again. I do think dependency will lessen
Okay.
as this kind of middle pathway becomes more viable. But when you look at when is an appropriate time to raise again, I think that comes down to not raising to survive. You should already be basically default alive and can survive without the raise, ideally. Phase is when you have a justifiable new growth endeavor and you want to accelerate it. That's the entire purpose of fundraising in the first place. It's to move faster than you can currently.
Okay.
But if you can still move fast without raising money, why raise more money again?
So if you put it in Malaysian
No, I was just going to throw in the last comment on the indigestion. You might be able to move faster, but you have to move appropriately. You're running down the mountain, which is very different than falling down the mountain. Falling down the mountain, you can get pretty fast.
Yeah, it's true. So if you put it in Malaysian context, and it's safe to say they budgets lah with unicorn ambition. That's one way to put it. Totally resonate with that. Yeah.
So some places will say ramen profitable or Maggi noodle, I guess is another way of putting it.
There we go. I'm not gonna lie, it's true. Wrap this with something practical. A cheat sheet for seed strappers who want to stay sane. What separates the one who make it, like you were saying, intentional hires, staying lean, from the ones who flame out?
Yeah, again, coming back to that cycle,
Yeah.
intentional hires, it's capital allocation. You need to be ruthless what you're going to focus on. And just don't take random money. Say no to dumb money, even when it's easy. Just because somebody's going to dump something on your lap, there's always strings attached with absolutely everything. There's many instances where you feel fundraising is a badge of honor. You know what's a badge of honor? MailChimp's bootstrapping and selling for $12 billion, the badge of honor.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unfortunate that he didn't give any stock options to his employees, but that's a completely different story. And maybe I'm wrong about that. That to me is pretty cool. Sure, you end up getting a little bit of capital, but if you can go big without a ton of dilution, and there's nothing wrong with raising either, but fundraising itself is not the badge of honor. Turning that startup dream into a big company, that's the badge of honor. So say no to dumb money too, even when it's easy. Tires, prioritization, no dumb money.
Kind of agree more. It's like life because shortcuts can turn out to be long cuts, and we don't want that. Anyway, so biggest red flag when someone thinks they want a seed strap, what would you tell a founder being pressured to raise big, but knows they're not ready?
Sometimes you get pressure to raise because your prior investor can't mark up your port unless there's another fundraise. So sometimes it's like optics in order to like raise their next round. There's other justifications of why are they pressuring. So there's an important aspect of understanding the position of the VC because there are nuances, but the investors have a vested interest in seeing the company succeed. What's best for the company is going to end up being best for the investors, and not everyone is going to end up agreeing. So part of it is being able to convey we're moving as fast as we can. We have this internal cash flow generation that is making us sprint at a breakneck speed. Because the key thing that oftentimes comes back to is like speed of growth. That's why you end up getting the pressure to raise because maybe they think that you could be going faster. And so if they're getting pressure to raise big, the response is, we're already moving as fast as possible. Adding headcount or cost doesn't make the revenue acquisition faster. It may not make the product development much faster. It just adds more complexity. when there's other things that need to be figured out. And in cases ends up being different. So I'm just throwing a couple of things out there.
Yeah, it again resonates with life when things are going so fast. Sometimes you just gotta take a beat, take a deep breath, and recalibrate, like we did with the first episode. Totally agree with you. So essentially, what you're trying to say is that you do need to build with intention. That intention that has to be the foundation of.
Yeah, 100%. It's intentionality out of what you're trying to do, and it's maintaining your intentionality in how you're doing it.
So if you're seed strapping, you're not exactly playing small either. You're playing smart. Do you have any final words for the low-key rebels out there? I guess you are in a good. You are speaking for yourself too, right? Learning from the best. Let's put it that way. A good way. A good way.
Yeah, I think the key thing is that there's more than one pathway, and I think the important thing coming out here is that we're seeing there's more viability. So we need to have more of that optionality. In markets like Southeast Asia, it's even more relevant to focus on sufficient growth and internal cash generation engine that enables you to bypass the endless funding rounds. No issues if you choose to go down that pathway, but the capital stack is not very deep here. So you need to preserve plan A and plan B.
Essentially, also, I think what I'm hearing is also strategic planning and being intentional about it.
100%.
All right, we talked capital efficiency, staying default alive, and playing smart, not small. If you're thinking about seed strapping, here's your cheat sheet. Be ruthless with your capital. Hire with intention, not aspiration. Just say no to dumb money, even when it's easy. But what happens when your co-founder isn't even human? So Chris Burrell joins us to unpack agentic AI, not just AI that automates, but AI that decides, adapts, and builds with you.
Yeah, so the tables are going to turn again. I'm out of the hot seat and back into the interviewer chair. So this one should be interesting. We get into the weeds. Think co-founder energy, but made of code.
We are breaking down hype versus reality and what this means for Southeast Asia's next wave of founders. Subscribe, share, and text this to someone who still thinks ChatGPT is the whole story. This is the Sea of Startups, where the game gets real.